is a wonderful topic, and I'm really pleased to see such a turnout. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Basma. I'll just briefly read the description on my phone. Dr. Basma is Vice President of the Maqasid Institute and Associate Professor of Public Policy. She's an international consultant on policy, governance, and Muslim affairs. Dr. Abdelgafar has worked in government, academia, and the third sector. She was a founding member of Public Policy in Islam Master's Program at Qatar University. For the past decade, she has taken an interest in public policy and governance in the Quran and in Sunnah, as well as in Muslim history, thought, institutions, and communities. She obtained a PhD in public policy from Carleton University in Canada, and her latest work, titled Maqasid al-Sharia in Public Policy in Islam, is currently in the publication policy. Dr. Basma has agreed to talk for about 30 minutes. There'll be plenty of time for questions afterwards. My job as facilitator is simply to keep us to time. So, Dr. Basma, you're very welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So let me start by thanking Dr. Mahani for expediting this presentation, Dr. Adrian for moderating today, Professor Amin and others who are here, distinguished guests. I know it's reading week. I appreciate the presence of everybody in this room. I was expecting 5 people, so I was a little less prepared. But this is a privilege. It's a privilege to be at the Policy Institute. It's a privilege to be at UBD and to be in your beautiful country, Brunei. I know that I share some of my ideas with many of you. I know I share with Professor Amin for sure. I've heard some of his speeches where he's spoken about governance and policy, so you do have some of the background that I'm going to talk about today. That said, let me give you a little bit, since I only have half an hour, and I'm going to try seriously to speak slowly. And I have a tendency to go very quickly, so if I do that, someone just raise their hand and tell me to slow down. Okay, so let's do an overview of the presentation. Today we're going to do a number of things in this half hour. We're going to define public policy in Islam. We're going to talk about how we go about the enterprise of public policy in Islam. We're going to consider a public policy in Islam framework. And then we're going to talk about 3 key elements in that framework. So in half an hour, we definitely don't have enough time to talk about the entire picture. So we're going to focus on morality and ethics, or akhlaq and adab, and there's a lot of talk around whether ethics is adab in Arabic or not. We're not going to get into those semantics or linguistics. We're going to talk about the higher objectives of the Sharia, or the Maqasid, when we talk about governance. And finally, we're going to talk about shura, or collective decision-making processes. Now, these would be the 3 main elements. As you'll see from the framework, there's more, but that's for a course in public policy in Islam. Actually, that's for a whole master's in public policy in Islam. So the definition. The first part of the definition, if you'll notice, is quite universal. Public policy is a course of action or inaction undertaken by a public authority or authorities to address a public problem, challenge, or to take advantage of an opportunity. That much of the definition is universal. That's what we study in all public schools everywhere around the world almost. But what happens when we qualify the definition within Islam? We can't go about the enterprise in the exact same way. We can't define it in the exact same way. So this is effectively what happens to the definition. It's the first half of the definition, so it becomes a course of action or inaction undertaken by a public authority or authorities to address a public problem or challenge or to take advantage of an opportunity that is checked, justified, and guided by 3 main elements: Quranic morality and ethics, the higher objectives of the Sharia, or Maqasid, and collective decision-making processes, shura. So this becomes our definition of public policy in Islam. Now, how do we go about this enterprise? How do we go about this qualification? That's very complex. As a matter of fact, it's taken me about a decade to come to the understanding of how we do public policy in Islam. So what we do is we take a compounded and very complex approach that examines concepts, purposes, phenomena, values, ethics, and divine laws or sunan, which are presented in the methods of the Quran itself, or what I call divine methodologies. So we don't go back, as in fiqh, for instance, and look at traditional, and look at the verses, or parts of the verses, or words. We have bigger units in policy. So we look, for instance, at dialogue as a method. We look at narratives, the complete narrative. We look at examples, or amthal. We look at anba' or akhbar, or khabar, which is informative news. We look at warnings. We look at exhortations. We look at allusions, metaphors. We look at repetition. What is being repeated throughout the text? Why is it being repeated? We also consider observation and experimentation, which is also in the Quran. God tells us to reflect. God tells us to think. God tells us to consider, to examine, to observe. And then we also consider the traditional permissions and prohibitions. So we study these elements as they manifest themselves in the methodologies of the Quran itself. So the way that God teaches us in the Quran. We look at how He teaches us, and we try to understand the maqasid from those teachings and those methods. So we know, for instance, from education, if anybody here comes from education and andragological studies, that these particular techniques are very useful for adult education. The use of dialogue, the use of narratives, the use of repetition, the use of rhyme, all of these things are very effective in education, particularly educating adults. Then the researcher takes the outputs of this process and collates them using a specific tool for analysis. So whether that's systems, or thematic analysis, or cyclical analysis, or phenomena analysis. And that depends on the research question. And the conclusions, of course, have to be bolstered by what we know of the Sunnah. Now, that's not it though. Because however intense and detailed this analysis can be, it can only ever be theoretical. And the policy sciences, for those of you who study policy, know that it has to be timely and relevant. It is problem-focused. It is context-oriented. It is multidisciplinary, and it is multi-method. Which means that the policy student or analyst has to be rooted in reality. Has to be rooted in the problem or the issue that they are considering. We cannot just go back to the Quran and the history. As useful as that is what I term fiqh nazari, or a theoretical understanding of what should be. And those of us who simply understand what the world presents us with have an understanding of reality, or fiqh al-waqa'. Now what policy studies have to do is integrate the two, take an integrative and comprehensive approach, which brings them together and produces something I call fiqh waqi'i, or a pragmatic fiqh. Practical solutions to contemporary problems. Now we can go on about methodology, but that resulted in this framework. So the framework for public policy in Islam kind of looks like this at this stage in my research and scholarly development, and it is an iterative process. Let me tell you, this is not a done deal. This is a very embryonic field for those of you who are studying in it. There is not much literature from the policy perspective. We have a lot in jurisprudence. We have a lot in siyasa shari'a, or sharia-oriented politics or policy, depending on how it's defined, but we do not have policy proper. It's a different beast than either fiqh or siyasa shari'a, although it is often conflated with one or the other. But the literature on policy proper is lacking. So this is under development, and it requires interested students who are willing to take up the challenge of creating a critical mass of researchers who are then going to give birth to further theory, improving the theory. Any framework is going to be the Quran and the Sunnah. The Sunnah as an elaboration, living example of the Quran. And that goes directly into the morality and ethics, which is the foundation of everything above it. Without morality and ethics, we cannot have a public policy in Islam. And if you ask me, I will tell you there is a crisis of morality globally, in all the policy sciences, and in politics, and perhaps in a number of other disciplines. So this is the foremost foundational issue when we're talking about public policy in Islam. Morality and ethics. Now there's a difference between the two. Morality is basically what the soul aspires to. Why we do what we do as human beings. Ethics is what justice requires. So we can agree to what justice requires, but we can do it for different motivations. So I will try to achieve justice because I believe in the human race. You will try to do justice because you believe in pleasing God. Someone else will try to do justice because there's a personal interest involved. This is the difference between morality and justice, and morality and ethics. So when we're talking about morality, and I'll go back to this framework in a second, when we're talking about morality, we're basically saying, as we said in the definition, that it checks, justifies, and guides public policy in Islam. And I have to tell you right now that that is not an unconditionally religious statement. You don't have to be Muslim. In fact, there's a number of reasons for that, and I'm not the one that outlined them. They are outlined in a brilliant work by Sheikh Muhammad Abdullah Draz, The Moral World of the Quran. And if you have not read that work, I suggest that you do. It is one of the most brilliant pieces in Islamic morality, and I guarantee you it has not been surpassed. He is the master of the masters when it comes to morality in Islam. So how does he explain this? He basically says, well, morality in the Quran is really divided between what he calls the intensive and the extensive. The intensive are the acts of worship, what we do internally as Muslims. But the Quran and the Sharia cover much more than that. As a matter of fact, they cover all aspects of life. So only a small portion of Quranic ethics is actually dedicated to worship and the intensive. Another point he makes is that the morality in the Quran is verified in this life. We can agree to certain things as human beings. We can see the consequences of our behavior. We can see the reaction of both natural law to our destructive behavior in the environment, for instance, and we can see the reaction of man-made law to our behavior. So the outcomes are very much revealed in this life. And finally, he said, it demands the use of reason. We all have to use our reason. It's not just what's there. So then he says, okay, so somebody's going to come and say, but the source text is religious. And he said, but even then, it's not an unconditional religious system. He said you cannot superimpose religion and ethics. And here he says, first, because reason came before positive religious law. God says in the Quran what? فَأَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا. So we all have ilham first and foremost. We all know good from evil. First, and before we learned the law of Islam, we knew it in our beings. Second, he says that we need our reason, of course, to accept and shape the moral rules. We just don't take them as given. And finally, which is very important, morality is only a starting point. And that perhaps is the most significant thing that people don't realize when they read a rule from the Quran, for instance. The rule is only the starting point. How you're going to adapt it, how you're going to apply it, how you're going to combine it with the resources, capacities, and strengths you have is your part in the legislation, your part in legal authority. So it is only a starting point. So what are the elements of the Quranic moral system? Draz gives us 5. Obligation, responsibility, sanction, which is the reaction of the law to our attitude, intent, and effort. The first one I have added from my study of Sheikh Draz. He does not include the first one, but I think the first one is very important in our understanding of morality in the Quran, especially for nations, especially for public policy. And that is that we understand who we are in the universal order. If you are a rich nation, your responsibility is different than if you are a poor nation. If you are a nation facing drought, you have different responsibility than a nation that has plenty. If you are a nation that has excess human resources, you are in a different position than a nation that has a shortage. And so on and so forth. So knowing your position in the universal order will help you understand what your obligations are, what your responsibility is. And it is not equal, and we know that from the Quran. It's not equal on an individual basis, and it is not equal on the level of the nation state. The moral system in the Quran can be understood to represent Islam's emphasis on human rights. Because really, what is it about? It's your obligations, it's your duties. Your duties to others around you. To your parents, to your community, to your school, to your friends, to your neighbors. Your responsibility in times of peace, in times of war, and again, and so on and so forth, and we can get into details in the discussion. But in policy, we have to go beyond the discussion of human rights. It's very important, and it has been understudied, and there's a whole chapter in my upcoming book on the importance of human rights. But that's only one dimension. In policy, we have to look at the ethical side. So understanding Quranic ethics. And in that particular discourse, human rights is only one perspective. And the Quran, because of its Tawheedi philosophy, brings in all other creation. So when we're studying policy, we ask, what is the philosophy that ought to guide us? And in the Quran, it's Tawheed. God says in the Quran that we must not sever what He commanded to be joined. It is extremely profound if you think of it. What did God command to be joined? Absolutely everything in creation is interdependent. Everything. Everything is dependent on something and other things. And there's a chain of interdependency in the universe. And the Quran draws attention to this. And this is the philosophy of Tawheed, is to understand that it's not just humanity. We are dependent on much more than other humans. When God says in the Quran, لا يستحي الله أن يضرب مثلا ما بعوضة, and God does not disdain from giving the example of a gnat or a mosquito. Why? فما فوقها, and everything above it. Why? Because it is so significant in the web of life. Because without it, so many other creatures would suffer, and if they suffer, the next level would suffer, and till you reach the human level. So when we're talking about public policy in Islam, we have this dilemma, and we have to understand that God did not guide us towards Tawheed to make our lives difficult. we have to then figure out where do we set the boundaries when we're talking about policy. How do we define issues if we believe in tawheed, if we don't want to harm anything? And this becomes a question for students. Where do you set the boundaries of an issue? How do we define a problem? Problems are very politically defined. In the Sharia, they have to go beyond that. We have to look at what we're benefiting and what we're harming. And where do we stop the harm? Or where do we stop the extent of benefit? What does that correlate to? Does it relate to national borders? The environment doesn't. Does it relate to public health? Public health doesn't. So where do we draw the line for our responsibility as a government? And these are the questions that we answer when we look at Quranic ethics. Then we have the Maqasid. And where does that come in? Remember I said, and I emphasized, that morality is only a starting point? If you do not have a maqsid in mind, an objective, if you do not understand the higher objectives of the Sharia, what are you aiming for with policy? You only have a starting point of what's right and what's wrong and what you can do and what you can't do. You also understand your circumstances, you understand your resources, you understand your governance capabilities, you understand your alliances, you understand the agreements that you have acceded to. But what is your goal? What are your objectives? You cannot actualize your morality without knowing where you want to end up. It's impossible. What are you going to actualize it towards? So Islamic morality and maqasid are two sides of the same coin. You have to know. And I'm going to explain this in detail in a second. So with the maqasid, we have a classical conception. Some of you might be familiar with it, of course. حفظ النفس والنثر والعقل والمال والدين والعرض. These are the 6 classical, which is the preservation of faith or religion, life, intellect or mind, wealth, progeny, and dignity or honor. Did I say that one already? Those are the 6. So we have the classic conception, which is a very good starting point. We can't accept it uncritically because it was not a framework that was created for policy and governance. It was a framework that was created for Islamic jurisprudence, for the law. In order for it to move into policy and governance, we have to respect the requirements of that field. So what happened with the maqasid over time is they were evolved. The evolution of the essentials, or the preservation of these 6 essentials. And then we saw them go from the preservation of religion to freedom of religions, the preservation of honor to human rights, the preservation of wealth to economic development, for instance. And we've seen them evolve, particularly over the past couple of decades. And as they did that, what happened? It was easier to shift the maqasid into governance. It just sounded more like governance. And so the shift was made uncritically in some international projects. They just took the maqasid as they are, and they began studying nations in accordance with the extent to which these nations were actualizing the maqasid through policies that already existed. I don't agree with that approach. I think it's a cop-out, and it's very easy to do. And it doesn't give us new ideas. Because anything can fit under the traditional maqasid, almost. Anything. Anything can be politically bargained to fit under the traditional maqasid because it was not intended for policy. It's not studied from a policy perspective. And we have to be cognizant of that. So then we have a missing edifice for policy and governance that hopefully some of you are working on. And there's some guidance from contemporary contributions. One of those contributions belongs to Professor Jessar Auda, which involves systems analysis. And it's going back to the Sharia, going back to the Quran, and looking at systems. And this can give us an in-between the very micro fiqhi approach, or legal approach, legalistic approach, let's call it that, and the much more open siyasa sharia approach. Because we go back to the Quran itself. We're not saying it's an unrestricted interest. Like in the siyasa sharia literature, we're actually saying there is some guidance there. And the Quran does prefer content and substance when it comes to governance at the national level, or community governance. We also have contributions of Tariq Ramadan, for instance, Professor Tariq Ramadan, who has lately highlighted, he's not the first, we had Dr. Taha Al-Alwani who also did this, who highlight the importance of balancing our knowledge of the universe and of nature and of the world around us with our knowledge of the texts, or the nusus as he calls them. So we do have these beginnings of new ways of building this edifice for public policy in Islam. Now, the question then becomes, how do we get, perfect timing, how do we get from a starting point of morality, an end point of maqasid? The Quran tells us we get there through shura, or collective decision making. Now, of all the topics I have spoken about anywhere in my life, this is probably the most fascinating. Shura in Arabic means اقتناء العسل من منابعه, which means what? The extraction of honey from its source. That is the most incredible allusion I have ever read, because it makes you stop and think, why? Why would God guide us to the honeybee when he's telling us about decision making among humans? Why not use a human term? Why say it's the extraction of honey from its source? For a number of reasons. When I first questioned, I went back to the scientific literature, I looked it up, and you should read the headlines. Honeybees can teach humans how to make the best decisions. Honeybees have the best collective decision-making process on Earth. And then in 2012, Professor Thomas D. Seeley wrote a book called Honeybee Democracy. And in it, he not only showed that the honeybee can teach us the best way to make decisions, 60 years of research have demonstrated that the way our brains work is the same as a honeybee swarm. It's mind-boggling. It is so interesting and so exciting. And so I started digging deeper and deeper into this, and you realize that these are some of the lessons that come out of the world of honeybees. First of all, it presents to us a certain kind of leadership. A leadership that is not autocratic, that sets criteria and boundaries for decisions and ensures the rule of law, but does not enforce specific decisions. It is a kind of leadership that doesn't necessarily express a specific political system. It could be a democracy, it could be a kingdom, it could be some kind of benign authoritarian system, whatever. That's not in the Quran. The political system is not outlined in the Quran. What is outlined in the Quran is the morality of any system that exists. And that's what we see in the animal kingdom. He didn't go to, if God had used a human term, we'd be looking for what example did they use? You know, were they a monarchy? Were they a democracy? See, he went to the animal kingdom. And the bees use something called indirect democracy, where a group of bees, the scout bees, are inspired obviously by God. If you're a Muslim, that's what you believe, there's an inspiration to make decisions based on specific criteria. So they know the criteria. These scout bees will go out, they will investigate certain options for where to live. They will come back and they will, through a process of presentations, convince the other bees to vote for that choice. And the more that they appeal to the criteria, the more they get followers. ultimately they have enough followers to begin implementing the decision. And in the process of implementation, they try to achieve consensus in the entire swarm so that everybody moves in the same direction. Now in the human world, this is most akin to epistemic or expert communities. These communities are expert in the issue that is being tabled. But they have one concern only, and that is to meet specific criteria for the public interest. And because they're focused on that, when they realize that a certain proposal is of greater benefit, or a hybrid of the proposals is of greater benefit to the public, they stop supporting their own. Because it's not a political race. It's not about, I want my interests served and I want the interests of my constituency served, but I know that the survival of my community and the nation is dependent upon my accepting the best choice, as opposed to a specific interest. Then, of course, the epistemic community, through its negotiations and its persuasion process, communicates with interested stakeholders and concerned publics, and the process goes as you see. And I will stop at that because I could go on, and I think my half an hour is over, and I want to respect that. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Basma, for that wonderfully stimulating presentation.